roadside comes from roadside attractions. And then reveries, the word reverie, it's just like getting lost in a memory, lost in a daydream. And there's this idea in the exhibition of like how when you're on vacation or in these kind of like psychedelic roadside attraction spaces, you do kind of see things differently. And a lot of works in the show are about kind of like seeing nature differently, like seeing it as more alive and more, just understanding it as like a living entity in a deeper way. So why I care about roadside attractions. So I grew up in Spring Hill, Florida, which is about an hour north of Tampa on the Gulf Coast. And there's a very legendary roadside attraction there, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there are a couple of smaller ones that I just went to a million times when I was a kid, and I still go to today. These very weird, eclectic places filled with a lot of very weird art-like things. Sculptures and paintings, but not sculptures and paintings made for galleries and museums, but more so made for these really specific places that are tied to these really specific locations. So this is like the most famous attraction in Spring Hill, the pink Pepto-Bismol dinosaur. It was built in the 60s by this guy Foxborough, who had a roadside attraction called Foxborough Wildlife. It was basically like a museum of natural oddities. And it was all taxidermy. So like taxidermied albino frogs and like two-headed snakes, two-headed calves, things like that. I went there a million times when I was a kid. It was so great. They had a super weird gift shop, weird candy, weird toys. I loved it. It closed, I think, in the 90s. But the dinosaur remains. And I also love how this is a recurring thing in roadside attractions too, where we'll talk about this a lot as the lecture goes on, but like roadside attractions are these places where nature and artifice come together in really interesting ways. So much of them are exploiting the landscape, exploiting animals in kind of sad and interesting ways. But history and fantasy come together in really interesting ways in these places as well. Like this is not an actual dinosaur species. It's sort of an apatosaurus, sort of a stegosaurus, like hybrid. It's just like a dinosaur, So that's another thing that's like interesting about roadside attractions to me. Here's another like dinosaur. This is just down the road. And these are on US 19, right? Again, these things built on the side of the road to kind of like draw your attention and like take your money. This is an old Sinclair gas station. Some of you might remember Sinclair Oil. Their mascot was an apatosaurus, kind of like shorter neck brontosaurus type dinosaur. But this still exists to this day. It's Harold's Auto Repair. The dinosaur is still there. And we're talking about roadside attractions, especially by where I grew up in Spring Hill and Brooksville. You gotta mention Boyette's Grove. It's one of the best roadside attractions in America. It's been there since the 60s. There's a lot of things there, but the main attraction there is, it's like a zoo for rescued exotic pets. So people would get like monkeys, especially in the 60s and 70s, they would have like monkeys for pets or like llamas or like a camel. And then they couldn't take care of it anymore. And so they donated them to Boyette's Grove, where up until relatively recently, you could go in and buy, it's like $5 to get in or whatever, but then you can also get like the add-on of a bag of zoo food, which is like popcorn and candy, oranges from the groves there, day-old bagels and baguettes from Publix, just like in a bag to feed the animals, which is not a great policy, but I'm like a little kid in the 80s, I'm like, this is great, I'm literally giving a lollipop to a monkey. This is amazing. And they're like unwrapping it and like licking it like a little boy or girl. So, but like a lot of these places, they are much more like focused on things like conservation and like having the animals have like as healthy a life as possible. But really amazing place. Again, there's a citrus processing plant there, a bunch of animals. They've all these dioramas set up from this like really devastating freeze that happened in the area in the late 1800s. Where just like a bazillion of these orange trees just died. Super, super fun place, run by the same people since the 60s. And the last thing I'll say about this place too, it's like, this family's run it for decades, and their son, James, who's like a little bit older than me, I think, at this point, but he's just filled this place with all of these weird paintings and sculptures. He does a lot of work with like Busch Gardens and Universal, creating props for like their Halloween nights and things like that. So just another place where it's like, you have these weird paintings, weird sculptures, weird architecture, but not made in like a fine art or gallery or museum context. They're made for this like really specific, heavily curated place. So again, as a curator, as an artist, these are like really interesting to me when I'm going to these places as an adult. And so lastly, Wikiwachi is also there. You know, if I'm like out of town and I'm talking to somebody and they're like, oh, like where are you from? At this point, I've learned to just say I'm from Wikiwachi because most people know like the mermaid place. They don't know Spring Hill, but they know Wikiwachi. So in the 40s, there was this guy who, he was like an underwater performer. He did some work with the Navy as well, but he had this idea to make an underwater theater, right? So you're not watching performers on the water, you're watching performers underneath the water. So they developed right into the spring, Wikiwachi Spring, an underwater movie theater. Underwater theater. It's sort of like an aquarium with movie seats. And he trained pretty women to like do these routines underwater. He also invented this breathing apparatus, these hoses that like squirt water out. Because when you're doing these acrobatic, very dance-like kind of choreographed things, you can't have all this clunky scuba gear on you or whatever. So he invented this whole kind of like new form of entertainment in the late 40s. It was super, super popular in the 50s and 60s. It kind of died out in the later half of the 20th century. Like a lot of these attractions in Florida, not just because of like Disney and Universal and Busch Gardens and things like that, but just like more interstates were built, more roads were built, so like a lot of traffic was diverted from where these places were built. So a lot of these places died out, but Wikiwachi in the early 2000s, they really like, after the state took them over in I think 2008, they really kind of like revived their whole brand. And now like in the last few years, mermaids have been like a really kind of popular thing in popular culture. So the other aspect of Wikiwachi is Buccaneer Bay, so they're attached. So here you see the amazing Wikiwachi Spring, and you see these water slides. There's this fake beach built as well on the spring. But I really love this image because this kind of speaks to, again, I mentioned earlier, one of these recurring themes of the show where like the artificial and the natural come together. You have this amazing natural wonder of the spring. It's one of the deepest springs in America. It's like 400 feet deep. They haven't even fully mapped out the bottom because it's so deep. And there are areas that I've been to when I was a kid where you're swimming and then you look down and it's just like this massive bottomless pit. It's like very disturbing. It's like very cool. It's like one of those things your friends dare you to do when you're little, when you like live here. So it's this amazing natural wonder, something like 171 million gallons of pure water just gush through it every day. The water's 74 degrees year round. It's just like this incredible thing that's like just there. But then we have to like build all this fun stuff around it to like appreciate it, you know? So we're gonna see this a lot in works in the show where it's like kind of adding artifice so that you can appreciate nature better. So artworks, and yeah, here's a performer and some manatees in Wikiwachi Spring. So artworks in the show fall under one of these categories. So there's mermaids and oddities from nature, souvenirs, the beach, theme parks, alligators, the side of the road, AKA the landscape, and then the road. So starting with mermaids, I meant to say this in the beginning, but you know, we're gonna talk a little bit about every artwork in the show, but I think I'm gonna kind of ruin mermaids in the next couple minutes as well for everyone, okay? So as this show was developing, you know, there's 22 artists from all over the US. The video artist is from London. But as the show started to get, you know, put together and become more cohesive, like all these different ideas started to sort of come out of the combination of these works. And one of the things that kind of happened as the show was coming together was that mermaids became like really important and really interesting. So if you think about mermaids from mythology, they're like these sirens, right? And they're luring sailors to their death. And they're doing this at Wikiwachi as well, right? So you have these very alluring, and I remember as a little kid, like being kind of disturbed by this sculpture because it just like towers over the entire town. It's these two nude figures, but they're like not good. Like it's not a good sculpture of the human form. They're like a little bit deformed and disproportional, and their faces are all kind of like contorted and weird. But, you know, like mermaids from mythology, which are luring sailors off of their paths, like they do the same thing on the side of the road, right? Like luring, especially in the 50s and 60s where like daddy is driving the car. It's like, oh, let's check this out. We have like literally these naked ladies floating in the air. And then like in the parking lot as well, there's tons of these, again, like very like erotic sculptures of these mermaids in the parking lot. Again, kind of luring you inside. But like, we don't think of mermaids as being these like very kind of sexy, erotic things. And that's something that's kind of incredible and kind of perfect about the mermaid as a figure in the context of roadside attractions, because there is this very like erotic component to these performances, obviously, especially early on. And the fact that they're underwater, that like really heightens all of that stuff as well. You know, their hair is always floating. They have this very otherworldly kind of dreamy movement to them. And again, the guy who started the attraction, like, he was consciously trying to do that on purpose. Their breathing apparatus, it's like this very phallic thing as well. But it's not like you're looking at a stripper or like a Hooters waitress or whatever. Like, this is a figure from mythology. This is safe. This is family friendly. So again, it's like this perfect like kind of mascot for these roadside attractions. And it got me thinking about, like, you know, women are historically portrayed in art to be seen by the male owner of the painting, you know? Like, as these things to be erotically appraised by the guy who owns the painting. Like, it's not about an individual actual woman or her sexuality or her desire. You know, they're these very passive figures that are there for like male enjoyment. So I started to like, just a couple of like very, very famous artworks came to mind from art history. Everybody has seen The Birth of Venus, right, by Botticelli. It's this very like erotic portrayal of this kind of anonymous woman, but it's fine. It's like safe to enjoy it because it's not a prostitute. It's not a performer. This is the goddess of love, the goddess of fertility. This is Venus, right? And something that's very famous about this painting too is that very kind of floaty, dreamy movement in the painting. Here it's not really created by water, which, by the way, I should mention, those performers, they're almost all female performers at Weeki Wachee. It's very, very physically difficult to perform like that underwater. But because it's in the spring, they're constantly fighting against this like 5 mile per hour current as well. So that also creates, again, that very dreamy movement, but it's like very physically demanding, very physically difficult to do. But anyways, this very flowy, dreamy movement in this painting, it's obviously from the zephyr figure, it's the air, right? It's not water. But it's very, very similar kind of floaty, dreamy, erotic kind of aesthetic. And I always would point this out in our history classes too. I mean, like, her center of gravity is such that like she can't even be standing up. Like, she's like kind of floating. She's in the process of falling down. You really imagine all the weight. It's all on that one leg, right? So she's like in this very imbalanced, floaty, again, kind of like underwater thing. I thought of this one too. It's a Bouguereau painting, very famous painter who's Matisse's teacher. He's a guy who was really hanging on for a long time for that to that 1800s neoclassical style. But this is like one of the most absurd, insane paintings like ever made. But it's like, oh yeah, no, I'm a serious man. Like, I have this in my drawing room. I'm not like a creep. I'm not a weirdo. I'm not just looking at like 47, 48, whatever nude women who are like all portrayed just for me in all these different delightful ways. It's like, nah, bro. Like, I'm not a sicko. Like, this is a scene from mythology. These are all of Artemis's, you know, mountain nymphs like flying back to her in the morning after like doing the hunting for her at night. I mean, this is just like a scene from mythology. But like, you literally have these 3 satyrs, like these 3 dudes like looking at the bazillion, like this pile of flesh that's just like whooshing up into the air. But again, right, the mermaids, it's like a similar thing, right? It's very kind of titillating in a lot of ways, but it's safe because they're these mythological features, or mythological figures. So to start to get into like some of the artworks in the show, so this is a piece called Cross Current by Kim Anderson. It's right behind us back there. And I'm not going to point out all of them, but I point this one out because it comes with this little walnut viewfinder that she made. But this is an oil painting based off of a vintage postcard from Weeki Wachee. So you can see they don't have the mermaid tails yet. But in this publicity image from Weeki Wachee, you know, you have these same kind of tropes of portraying women in art at play, where it's like the face is all blacked out. You don't see the face. She's not an individual. There's this emphasis on her cheeks and her muscular legs. But this also kind of calls to mind Again, very famous works from art history. This is a famous painting by Boucher. It also has this double nature, like her painting has these double figures, where he initially makes this portrait of this girl that the king was into that looks like her, and then kind of word spread, it became famous, and then he made another one for public consumption with a much more kind of doll-like, generic face. But really, really similar body language on these guys. I thought that was like an interesting connection to art history. But the doubleness of that painting is because it's a stereoscopic image, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with these. The Elliott Museum actually usually has one out that you can play with in that kind of old-timey pharmacy part of the museum. But this was a common thing in the early 20th century. It's basically a photograph of the same subject taken from two slightly different angles, and you put them side by side, and then you put them in this device that basically forces your left eye to only see this image, and then it forces your right eye to only see this image. Again, everyone's familiar with the Viewmaster. Viewmasters operate on the exact same way. So when you look at like the little pictures in the ring, you have these the two images are across one another, where it's, again, the same subject from two slightly different angles. The thing forces you to only see the right image through your right eye and the left image through your left eye, and it creates this like illusion of three-dimensionality. Because that's how we can perceive three-dimensionality in the real world, looking at stuff in space, right? Because we have stereoscopic vision. It's two eyes looking at things from slightly different angles, and that's how we can kind of like guesstimate that some things are closer, some things are farther away, AKA they're in 3 dimensions. It's funny that we start with this one mermaid performer photo that really falls in line with that like super old school kind of problematic way that historically women are depicted in like European and Western art. And then we have these other mermaids that are very, very different. Like you don't even see the tails. There's the emphasis on their faces, obviously. The one on the right is like very confrontationally looking directly out at you as a viewer. There's just very, very subtle hints of them even being mermaids. There are the titles, but there's also these like very abstract kind of shell and fin shapes, right? This figure has these kind of like fin-like things coming out of her face. And then we go all the way to this other figure that I'm like interpreting in the context of the show as being like a kind of mermaid figure, kind of like even farther away from those traditional depictions of women in art, where you don't see her face, but like you can't even see her face, but she can see you. Right, like through this veil. There's also this kind of like hint of like BDSM stuff happening, maybe with the rope around the neck and the horseshoe crab bra, like right that maybe like the horseshoe crabs are like clamped on or something, maybe like that. But this also transitions to this next category in the show, which is like we have mermaids, but then we have these like oddities from nature. Like this could also be again like a Southern Gothic mermaid, or like some kind of weird cryptid. But again, that transitions into, oddities from nature. So this is one of like many works in the show where you could imagine seeing it at an old school roadside attraction. Like, oh, come see the crystal marlin, I should have included an image of this, but if anybody's ever been to a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, they always have one of those fish with the fur on it, right? Like, oh, come see the fish with the fur on it. So it's kind of like that. But even more than that, like another thing that is running through a lot of works in the show is like, I mentioned earlier how the landscape is exploited by these places in a lot of different ways, and repackaged and commodified in a lot of different ways. Animals obviously are kind of repackaged. They're kind of recast as objects of fascination or as performers. But works like this, again, they're very fantastical, very like impressive and inspiring. There's 100,000 crystals on this like, fiberglass, mounted marlin. And she's not just like bedazzling it, right? There's like 30 something different crystals. There's like 17 different kinds of coatings that she's putting on the crystals to get the color just right, to sort of make it look natural. But it's really incredible, impressive kind of trophy. But at the same time, going back to like how, our relationship with animals and how that's kind of warped through encountering them in these type of roadside attractions, it makes me think of like an actual marlin and just the amazing power and grace and beauty of that, and how difficult it is to capture even just like images of them. it's very hard to find like good footage of marlins doing their thing because they're so fast. And it's like, just imagining like an alive, just that, again, like the beauty and power of like an alive marlin versus like 100,000 crystals. It's like the alive marlin is still better, you know? That's just another like added dimension of this thing that I really like. It's also like a nod to hunting and fishing, which are like, those are like the earliest tourists that you have in Florida, wealthy northerners coming down to hunt and fish during the cold months. Again, another kind of oddity, right, that you can imagine seeing in a roadside attraction. It's like, come see the weird alligator fox dying bug. So this is a piece by Kelly Bamer. This is one of a couple works in the show that kind of reminded me of things like this, going back to mermaids. Is everybody familiar with the Fiji mermaid? This is like a very famous hoax that happened, I think, in the late 1800s. This is, I think, in the permanent collection at Harvard. But there was just a guy who would just like cut a monkey in half and sew it to the bottom half of a fish and dry it out until it became kind of mummified, and then just sort of display them as like, oh, this is a real mermaid that I found. So, this kind of hybrid creature reminded me of those. And her work is very, like, it's simultaneously very grotesque, but like also very inviting. So you have this giant, gross, dying bug with like actual teeth and like glitter drool coming out of it. But going back to the glitter drool, it's like, it's very gross, but she uses all these very inviting, kind of soft materials. The very brightly colored faux fur and these different kind of like sheer fabrics. So there's always this really interesting, like, you're kind of simultaneously drawn to it and like repelled and grossed out by it. But it's not just like being gross for gross sake. A lot of the work like this feels really kind of like you're seeing this tortured, crucified animal or whatever. But for her, a lot of her work is about personal anxiety of like getting older and just like your body changing. But she sees these as these kind of like positive works that are about like transformation and like personal growth and things like that. Positive change in general. And just another really quick, like, again, kind of like natural oddity, like, oh, come see the like weird wooden bird reptile thing by Nancy Dillon. But this also transitions into the next part of the show, which is just like souvenirs or keepsakes that you find when you're on vacation. And Nancy is just like a perfect example of this because she has this whole body of work where she's just finding these little scraps on the ground of like rocks and twigs and leaves that suggest the shape of something, like a little guy or an animal or like some sort of structure. And she'll take the little rock or twig or whatever that she finds and she'll blow it up really big and make these like hyper-realistic drawings of it. But she'll like nudge it and push it a little bit so that the weird kind of figure that she's seeing in this natural form is like a little bit more obvious to other viewers. So this is just like a weird little piece of wood that she found that like suggested a flying bird. But again, this kind of transitions into the next part of the show, which is, again, keepsakes and souvenirs. This is a collaborative piece by Kim Anderson, the same woman who did the Wikiwachi painting, and her husband, Lofgren. Just very, like something you would find, like a kind of tacky souvenir in a Florida gift shop. And you see some of the animals that you would see, again, the kind of natural oddities that you would see in roadside attractions as well, like the two-headed deer. And just this sort of simple collage move of taking, this cardinal from another sculpture and like adding it to this one where it's slightly, it's like way too big compared to the other animals. It's, again, another kind of like subtle natural oddity, just like the giant cardinal or the two-headed deer. And then this piece by Mary Siegfried, again, talking about like souvenirs. She's 93. And I was visiting her. I met her when I was working in Sebring a couple years ago. And I was visiting her maybe like a year ago, and I was talking to her about this show, and she was like, oh, well, let me see if I can like make something for it. Because she is an amazing artist who just has so many scraps of different things, and she's just constantly making stuff. So a couple months later, she just gave me this. So she just took a bunch of her old postcards and old maps and old brochures from Florida attractions, some old photos, some old drawings and notes that she had written. This is like the first license plate that she got when she first moved here in the 70s. And she bound it all together in this book that you can flip through. And I don't think I've seen anybody do this yet, but there are things that you can like pull out and like look at maps and like look at these descriptions of a lot of these places that just don't exist anymore. This piece as well, this is one of the first things that I thought of when I was initially putting the show together. Again, it looks like a kind of cheesy figurine at first that you would get at, again, just like a Florida gift shop or a roadside attraction. But what I really like about this piece is that it, again, speaks to this idea of seeing nature kind of in a truer way, when you're on vacation. You have this anthropomorphized little palm tree guy who's kind of washed up on this deserted island, and he's just kind of resting, bummed out, whatever, chilling underneath this other palm tree. And you can read the body language of the palm tree guy or gal. And then that leads me to start to read the body language of the tree itself, right? And palm trees, especially in Florida, we really just conceive of them as just images, if you even perceive them at all anymore. But there's something about this that, I don't know, it makes the palm trees seem more alive, seem more like they have character. And that's a really powerful thing that art can do. Similarly, right? So transitioning from souvenirs to the beach, this is another piece that for me really kind of exemplifies this idea of these kind of revelations you can have when you are broken out of your everyday routine and are just relaxing. So we have Jill Kerwick from Melbourne, Florida, just looking down at her fresh pedicure, seeing this starfish. This is probably not in Florida. This is probably based off of something that happened to her in New Jersey, where she lives the other half of the year. But yeah, there's just something about the starfish right in the middle, with the star being this very cosmic symbol, and then you have all this kind of psychedelic ripples of the reflections of the water around it. It again, to me, just exemplifies this idea of just having these kind of deep cosmic experiences with nature on vacation. And this is another piece by Jill. She has so many pieces that take place at the beach, but she just has so many different ideas for, just so many different ideas, even though they're all ostensibly a figure at the beach. It's really astonishing how many ideas she gets out of that. But I love this painting as well. This is kind of the past and the present coming together. It's a depiction of the first tourists coming to Florida, from Spain. And there's this really interesting collapse of the past and the present, or way of showing stuff from the past, how that echoes out into the present day, sort of haunting the present. It reminds me of Jaws too, which is so horrific and so suspenseful, but that's all taking place in the brightness of a summer day, So there's a similar thing happening here. It's this bright summer day, and the boogie boarder is boogie boarding. But there is this very ominous feeling, right, with these kind of colonial ships in the background. Again, kind of haunting the present. So still at the beach, Matt Wicks, he's a sculptor who's really interested in how the materials of sculpture kind of really radically alter what that sculpture is about. So here he's basically used the materials for vintage beach chairs. I don't know where he got this vintage polypropylene webbing, but it's brand new. But he's using these materials that are usually used for beach chairs to create this weird, surreal double stretcher, right? A thing that's used to carry, deceased or injured bodies. The title stretcher also might call to mind stretcher bars from a painting. There's also this there's also this interesting relationship with 2D art and painting as well, and minimalism. But it's not meant to be actually used, obviously, but he's basically taking the original object, stripping it of its original function, and changing the materials so that you can see them in, unfamiliar ways. And so this is the short film that's playing on the monitor in the exhibition by Susanna Wallen, which transitions to the next part of the exhibition, which is amusement parks. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful short film that I think really perfectly, it's just a great example of pure film, where she's using editing to really give you, as a viewer, the experience, the inner experience of the figures in the film. So it's basically a bunch of tweens going to this theme park, riding these scary rides, having a good time, being nervous, laughing, having fun. But it's not just a depiction of teens riding rides. it's really elegantly edited in a way where you as a viewer feel that same kind of excitement, that same kind of disorientation, and like really particular kind of disorientation of being on these, kind of dizzying thrill rides. But really amazing way of like, again, making the inner experiences of the figures in the movie like available to the artist through pure cinema, like through editing. Really super beautifully edited. So still on theme park. So I really wanted to avoid having a picture of Mickey Mouse in the exhibition. Because like I said before, Disney isn't like the only reason why a lot of these roadside attractions don't exist anymore. So I didn't want to have like a kind of villainous like Mickey Mouse or something in the show. But for whatever reason along the line, along the show's development, Nicole Newstead's work came to mind. And I was looking through this series of paintings that she did of Kermit. And I was like, oh my God, these would be perfect for the show. And I started to think about Kermit as being kind of like an anti-Mickey Mouse. Just as a character, he's a lot more like human and thoughtful, But even just like visually, if you think about it, like Mickey Mouse is black and red and Kermit is mostly green and white. Like they're literally opposite colors. Mickey Mouse is very round. Kermit is very kind of like angular and pointy. His movement is a lot more kind of jerky, whereas Mickey Mouse is like very like very flowy. Even when the performers dress up like him at Disney World, like they're very kind of like creepily like choreographed and like flowy. It's weird, it's gross. And then Mickey Mouse too, like he has the big balls on his head, which are ears, and Kermit has like the big balls on his head, which are eyes. So I don't know, like the more like time I started thinking about Kermit versus Mickey Mouse, it's like, oh, there's all these like really interesting like yin and yang relationship between those two guys. But this piece by Nicole, it's like, it seems so simple at first. It's like a monochromatic still life portrait, kind of. But just the more time that I spent with it, just like the heavier and heavier it became. So she, as I said before, she's done a whole series of these paintings of her old stuffed animals that she kind of rediscovered during COVID. These things that like really inspired and like developed her imagination when she was a little kid. But then like in the 2020s, as an adult, she's using them almost kind of like reaction gifs. A lot of the paintings from this series would just be really good reaction gifts when you're texting with somebody. Just because they're so moody and they express such like kind of exasperation and such like deep emotion through just like body language. But for me, this one in particular, it just made me think about like, and I should say too, all these artists have their own thing going on in all these artworks. Like that's something that's really fun about putting these group exhibitions together is like, the meanings of them will change sometimes really radically just because of their context, because they're surrounded by all these other works. So in the context of this show, this painting really became for me sort of like a way of making visible that feeling of being a little kid where, you're going to attractions, you're going to theme parks as a little kid and you think it's real. Like you go to Disney World, you see the guy dressed up like Goofy and it's like, oh, like that is Goofy, like signing my book or whatever and like giving me a hug. And then like eventually your brain develops and you're like, oh, okay, this is just make-believe. This is just for fun. This is just entertainment. So this painting for me almost became like a depiction of that moment where you're like kind of realizing that this stuff is not real anymore. And then simultaneously, like knowing, Nicole's context for this work, it became almost like, it's like the toy is kind of turning its back on the adult. It's like, oh, you've lost your sense of like whimsy and imagination or whatever. So seems so simple at first, but just again, the more time that you spend with this painting, kind of the heavier and more interesting it gets. And even just formally as a portrait, it's just something very evocative, very kind of like stirring about this, just like the starkness of it. So getting out of theme parks, is kind of the last thing that's kind of relates to theme parks in one way or another. This is a painting by Dolores Coe. Who she combines like recognizable imagery and then like her own particular brand of like non-representational art making in this really interesting way. Most of the time she's doing that as a way of making it a little bit more obvious that she's not painting a thing from life or from photos, like she's painting her memories for the most part. So here we have this image of an abandoned shooting range that she just discovered on the side of the road near where she lives in Ruskin, where they had all of these worn down, like inoperable animatronic animals that you could practice shooting with the bow and arrow. So, you know, having the panther or bear, whatever it is, on this animatronic thing just kind of brought to mind the like super high tech aspect of theme parks. When you think about especially the newest rides at like Universal or Disney or whatever, they're just insanely high tech. You know, you're in these massive vehicles flying around with 10 other massive vehicles. They're not even on tracks. They're like controlled by Bluetooth. It's like holograms and lasers and stuff. They're like very, very high tech. So it kind of called to mind that, this like very basic animatronic, and like, you know, just reminded me of how roadside attractions are generally very, very low tech, very, very low-fi. And this again is kind of like a callback to that, the history of hunting and fishing in Florida, as well as being like a very early kind of tourist attraction. And you know, we're in this rounding it out now with alligators in the swamp. Seminole alligator wrestling, another super early roadside attraction. This is by Big Dog Elliott. But he's basically reimagining this like really early Seminole Village attraction of, again, wrestling alligators as more like a WWF kind of thing. I don't know if there's any wrestling people. Like, do you know what this move is? Like, I don't know. But again, they're very like over-the-top theatrical like WWF moves. Running out of time, going really fast. And then so there's Mary Siegfried as well, the same artist who made the license plate book, basically depicting an airboat ride, right? Again, another kind of like tourist trap kind of thing you can do in Florida. This one's actually operated by an alligator. It's called Smiley's Airboat Rides. It's on his shirt and it's on the flag. There's also a little sign that says free lunch. And in Mary's words, you know, if you sign up for an airboat ride with Smiley, like, you are the free lunch. And so you could like see like all of these like hints of people who Smiley has eaten before. But I really, really love this one because again, she just has a million things like this, where she just has so many things she's collected over the years that she just, you know, cobbles together in different ways. But the whole thing is on an old cypress knee, which is, there was this very famous roadside attraction in Central Florida where it was like a museum of cypress knees, which I'm sure many of you have seen those. I know you have, but I'm sure many of you have seen those just even in the wild. They just have these very surreal, very interesting, like ambiguous forms. So there's a guy who, the structure is still there, by the way, but yeah, there was a very famous museum of cypress knees in Central Florida as well. And then, so we're gonna use alligators to transition into Ruby C. Williams. So Ruby C. Williams is like my favorite part of the show. It's really amazing that we have some paintings by her in it. But she was a painter in Bealsville. She had a produce stand about like maybe like 60 miles, no, I'm messing up the numbers. Maybe like an hour east of Tampa on State Road 60, where she sold produce since like the late 80s. She was born there in the early 20th century, but she lived in New Jersey for a lot of her adult life. But she moved back in the, I think, the late 80s and worked on this produce stand. Her family, like she's directly descended from a group of African Americans who immediately after emancipation, as like recently enslaved people, started this town of Bealsville in the late 1800s. I think her grandmother was a part of that original group. So she's had this land in her family for like a very long time. They're all very proud of it, obviously. They've been like living off of it, you know, since then, growing produce and selling it. She started painting, you can kind of see here, she started painting these signs to advertise the food, the produce, like the collard greens and the strawberries and stuff, because this is by Plant City. The strawberries are really good. And then eventually in the early 90s, she started making just straight up paintings. So this is a recurring figure in some of her paintings. It's basically an alligator. It's kind of like this alligator type guy. But I love this painting so much, especially in the context of the show, because it's like, oh my God, yet another alligator. But you see her like signature use of text where she spreads it out in this weird way where you have to like really kind of like think about it as you're reading it, which I think is super smart. But it says, tired of being the good guy. And, you know, again, it's just like a really interesting sentiment to attach to this alligator, which usually is like very, they have these very inscrutable faces, right? They seem very menacing, very strong. But you know, she's humanizing the alligator in this really interesting way. This like creature that has this like super tough, you know, super, again, like menacing exterior. You know, it's like smiling, you know, and with her text, like she just humanizes it in this really amazing way. And her work in general has this very like emotional heft to it. So in the show, we have a couple of just straight up signs that she made. And as a curator and as a painter, I'm like really interested in this too. It's like what is the line between like a sign and a painting? It's like, when does the sign become a painting, or like vice versa? But the first one says, to you, and again, just the way she does the typography, it's like so good. To you that think you are so smart, pay now or higher prices later. So this is something that she would just have like out among her paintings outside. And then also just kind of like PSAs. Women, teach your kids, don't throw rocks at the baby goats, because that was like a problem, I guess, for a time at the stand. But then we have, yeah, just these amazing paintings. So another one just advertising her fruit, right? Sweet oranges. I love this one so much in the context of the show as well. It's just like a guy picking this amazingly huge strawberry and just being like, hey, just like greeting the strawberry, you know? But you'll notice, obviously, the works are like very haggard and kind of worn. So she actually passed away a couple weeks before Hurricane Ian. And again, she's in like the Plant City area, was in the Plant City area. And yeah, she passed away a couple weeks later. Hurricane Ian hit, and it like destroyed her shack and her stand. So another artist in the show who's like super obsessed with Central Florida history because it's just his hometown. He and a friend went there to check on it. Like after Ian, there was like all this devastation in Central Florida where I was living at the time. And his first thought was like, oh, we like gotta check on like Ruby's thing to see like if it's okay. So it was not. And so he salvaged like maybe 24 paintings, like literally pulling them out of the mud. And that's where all her paintings in this show came from. So since then, I mean, when he initially went, he was already, you know, in contact with her family. But as he puts it, like her son is in his 70s and has worked outside his entire life. So he just doesn't have like the bandwidth to deal with her paintings right now. They're much more kind of like focused on the farm and things like that. So we're kind of hoping that this show like raises more awareness of her work, you know, in South Florida. And then hopefully some people are like interested in buying these things so that the family maybe gets a little bit more interested in like restoring and preserving them. But just really, I think super important part of like Florida art history, Ruby C. Williams. And again, she was just like always there. Like you could just go. When she was alive, you could just go anytime and like chill with her and look at her paintings. She would display them outside like this, but she had like a big shed that you can go in and like flip through them like big records too. Super funny. Her work is super funny and smart. Oranges, citrus, right? A big part of like early tourism in Florida. It's just a plein air painting by Blair Updike. I wanted to include this painting by Jim Graham as well. He's done a lot of work kind of about commodifying the Florida landscape in different ways. But for me, in a much like simpler way, this painting in particular is this like amazing combination of inside and outside. A lot of his work, he is really consciously trying to like erase that division between like the landscape and like where we are as people like looking out at it. And that's something that I think is really great and really subtle about this painting. It's like you're kind of looking at this landscape, but like where are you looking at it from? It's like you are also kind of outside, but there are these empty shoes there, right? It's like makes me think of like taking your shoes off before going into the house. So a lot of really interesting kind of opposites at balance in this painting, but for me, like the major, like most important one is like this division between inside and outside, and also kind of like the domestic and the wild is really erased as well. We have this, again, very like quote unquote, like kind of wild, swampy Florida landscape, and then these very like manicured, kind of tended after domestic plants surrounding it. Just all that stuff in this really remarkable balance. Wanted to have a reference to camping as well. This is a piece by Roger Palmer. He's been painting in this kind of like Zen way, Japanese, Chinese Zen way for like a very long time, for decades and decades. He usually incorporates text as well, like those Chinese and Japanese paintings, but in English. This one says, camping on the edge of the great big eye. You can interpret this in a lot of different ways. I think my thoughts initially go to like surveillance, but in the context of this show, I love how it's like you're kind of confronted with this giant alligator eye. Again, it goes back to this idea of like seeing these things from nature, not just as like images or commodities, but it's like actual living things, right? So you're like forced to like look it in the eye, you know, for the sustained period. That can be, and hopefully everybody has had that experience with like a wild animal, or even an animal in captivity where you've like locked eye contact for a long time. Like that can be like a very, very powerful thing that again allows you to see that thing not as just an object for your amusement, but as like, you know, a living thing. I could go on about this for a long time, but we're running out of time. And then Nabil, he's the photographer who rescued Ruby C. Williams' work. He's done a lot of work about Central Florida, but this is like the last part of the show, you know, the road itself. Obviously, all of these places exist to draw people off of the road. This is from a series of photographs that Nabil did in 2022, where he was focusing on the movement of water and the movement of people. And Lakeland, where he lived, they just had this huge influx of people during COVID. And a lot of those people moved there for political reasons, and just the vibe of his hometown changed like really dramatically, really, really quickly. So he became really interested in like the movement of people in Central Florida and the movement of water in Central Florida. This is a very like eerie piece that he made of I-4. I know a lot of people here are like scared of I-95, but I-4 is like a lot worse. Like in the morning, during the day, at night, there's like no relief. It's horrible. And if you're going to any of these like major attractions in Orlando, you have to be on I-4 at some point. But I say this is a very eerie photograph of I-4 because it's like you will never see it like this. There's no people, there's no cars. But he, you know, this is a long exposure photograph. So anything that was moving when he was like pointing the camera at his subject, anything that was moving, any cars, you know, the light reflecting off of those didn't get registered on the photograph. So it made it look like, because it was long exposure, it looks like the roads are empty. That's also why the sky looks so dense, because you're seeing a lot of like cloud movement happen in one image. So it looks very kind of like post-apocalyptic. It's like there's this airborne toxic event happening or something. But again, we could talk about Nabil a lot, but we have to have some references to the road. In the exhibition, you have this kind of like pit stop when you're going to the next room of this like breakfast joint. Rachel DeCuba does a lot of pieces like this where she has digital photography printed on fabric, and she integrates that with like traditional quilting. This is, again, a very kind of vague reference, I think, to like Seminole patchwork as well. But just formally, these things are really, really interesting. But again, just like another experience, this is just a photograph she took, again, of like this abandoned place on the side of the road. But yeah, another kind of like part of the road trip, you know, stopping and getting breakfast, a literal depiction of a car trip, also by Kim Anderson, the Wikiwachi painter. The work that she does, her paintings that are not still lifes, all those other paintings are usually based off of found vintage photographs or postcards or things like that. And she really meticulously kind of like paints all the imperfections. But I love how it's like, obviously it's like the worst thing to have in your photograph is this kind of lens flare. But she really kind of like amplifies the lens flare in this crazy way. It's, even in person, it's just like very aggressive and blinding. But this is just a great, like just great vibes in this painting. And then the last painting is by Walter Matthews. His whole thing is like trying to find like kind of like wonder and like visual excitement in his everyday surroundings. But I thought this is like a great image to end on, because to me, we're talking about like how you're like seeing things differently when you're on vacation. But like when you come back home, you know, everybody has that feeling of like things feeling a little bit like unfamiliar and everything seems a little bit more like vivid and intense. And that's definitely the vibe that you get in this painting. And even something about the way the cat is painted, it feels very like ghostly and unreal. The most obvious example is this like white glowing tree in the middle. But yeah, so that's Roadside Reveries, y'all. We said a little bit about everything in the show. We totally have time if you have any questions or any observations.
You talked earlier in the presentation when you showed, was it Boy Scouts? What's the name?
Oh, Boyette's Grove.
Boyette's, which I just went to a couple of months, for the first time a couple of months ago, I drove by that. You talked about the idea of the artwork being people traditionally outside of the museum or gallery?
No. Well, not that those people, because he's done a lot of that guy's done a lot of like interesting work. Yeah, I don't know that he's really shown in museums. But sorry, finish your sentence. I wasn't trying to say it was worse.
It was wonderful too. My only question was how important in putting the show together was it to have an outsider artist like Ruby? Like, was that something you were looking for?
Well, Ruby is just like she's literally has her work on the side of the road. You know, and just again, the way that you just see the food differently as this like precious, like amazing thing through her paintings. So that's why I wanted her, and not necessarily because she was not like making work for galleries or museums, but you're right, she's doing the same thing. Like she's making these paintings, but she's making them for this other like specific place, which is just super fascinating to me because it's like, it's just such a boomer. I'm like gonna sound annoying, but you know, we have access to everything anybody has ever made right on our phones, right? Up until very recently, if you wanted to see a work of art, you had to go to the one place on the earth where that thing existed, you know? And that thing that was made had that place in mind. Like it was made for that place, and that place is like an intrinsic part of its meaning. So that's why, I mean, this kind of stuff, I mean, this is not even the best thing. It's just the most high resolution image I could find off of Google. But, you know, the fact that that stuff is made for that particular context is like really exciting and really interesting. Like if you were to see it in a gallery, it might not hold up or be interesting, but it changes a lot.
Great presentation.
Context is hugely important. Thank you. Did you like it? You went inside?
I went inside. I didn't pay to do the thing because it is complicated, and you're like, oh, it's out again.
Yeah. There are a lot.
They had a local, there was some kind of a local monster, which is also like something you see in roadside attractions. It's something with a name. I forget what it was called. I remember they had a name for it. It was like, you know, from the 30s, it would haunt the swamps or whatever. But I didn't pay for that either. I just got ice cream and bought some jam and stuff.
Yeah, we used to call it the ice cream zoo when I was a little kid because we would get ice cream afterwards. Yeah, well, like you said, there's obviously this like weird conflicted feeling that you get going to zoos in general, especially very like lo-fi ones that aren't like run by like the state. But they've definitely gotten way better over the years. I mean, and one more fun thing about like feeding the animals, like you can see they're just these chain link enclosures, but the spider monkeys, you know, they'd be in a chain link thing and then there'd be a chain link fence, so you couldn't get like right up into it, but you could just reach over and like feed them popcorn or like an orange or something. But when you're a little kid, you can't reach. But the spider monkeys, they have long prehensile tails, so it's like if you held out an orange or something and they'd be like, they couldn't reach. They would then like turn around and like stick their tail out through the thing and then be like, and like, oh my God, it's like so thrilling. But yeah, they all kind of knew the deal. Like they were all used to humans and stuff, but they were not feeding them the most healthy stuff back in the day. But I'm sure they've learned a lot over the years. I went last summer actually, and there's only a small area where you can feed them. You can only feed like the llama and I think the camel, and they have actual like nutritious food, you know, that's you know good for their diet or whatever. So it's a lot better for sure. Any other cues?
Would like Seashell World fit into these categories?
Oh wait, seashell. I feel like I can imagine exactly what that is, but I don't know what you're talking about.
Show World.
Oh, like on one or whatever? Or no?
They have them on down in the Keys. Yeah, you can get your turret card when you go home. It dies there and makes your house.
Oh dear. Yeah, no, that's sad.
They had all sorts of ticky
Well, exactly. I mean, that's something that I was thinking about like really early on too, like about how so many of those souvenirs are. That's one of like the earliest like thoughts in the show is like how many of those souvenirs are like carcasses, you know? So that I was trying to like get that in the show really early on, but that wasn't really going anywhere. But I did have the thought of like getting like a weird shell thing just from the store and putting, you know, with like googly eyes on it.
Yeah.
But then like Mary's work, I feel like kind of satisfied that impulse of having something that.
That alligator, by the way, that she had on the cypress knee.
Oh yeah.
That's like a very specific toy you got in Florida that they haven't made forever, where the bottom lid was soft, so it didn't hurt a kid.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I remember very clearly being like, "That's not an alligator. Look how soft it's not."
I felt so many alligators' mouths. They're not that soft. But yeah, no, Mary's great. She's so super funny and super prolific. Most of her work is more kind of like quilting, like applique type stuff. But she does a lot of like painting on fabric. Mary's amazing.
It's interesting. He was making a comment. My grandmother got given as a souvenir of a trip to Florida by some young person that she helped throughout her maturity and adolescence, associated with the orphanage where she worked. She got given a cypress knee, and she wrote the girl's name on the bottom of it, but it also carries the initials of the probably seminal guy who actually polished the thing and finished up the wood.
Yeah, I think he just boiled them.
Yeah.
I was doing some research, yeah.
Yeah.
But there are places in Central Florida. I mean, I've seen them out here, but there were places in Central Florida. It's like you're walking through the woods or through like a trail, and there's just all these like gloppy, weird things just like hovering above the ground. Just their forms are surprisingly like very suggestive, and you can see figures and animals, and they're just like wild ones growing. And yeah, nobody really actually knows like what the point of them are in terms of like tree studies or whatever. It's like maybe it helps the soil to this, or maybe it helps distribute nutrients, blah blah blah. But nobody really like knows for sure. But yeah, it is illegal to cut them, even on your private property. I think you need a permit or something. Any other questions?
When I was a kid and I saw that, I was probably about 8, I guess, when the girl gave it to her, and I saw it in my grandmother's house. I just thought that was so cool. It looked like it was from outer space.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, yeah, they're exactly. Yeah, I worked with an artist a couple years ago who was doing a lot of paintings of cypresses, and she would say the same thing. Like, she would get that comment all the time, where it's like, "Oh, this looks like it's from like another world or whatever." But it's like, yeah, they're very, mysterious.
This is cool too. It makes it like uniquely Florida too. Like when I went to this place, I was driving a friend around. We grew up, and we went by some of the orange groves, which you mostly see from where you're from. And I was telling you, when I was a kid, I remember they would just give you like an orange and this weird little straw that you stuck.
Oh yeah, and like never worked.
I didn't understand. I'm like, I don't think it would work.
It's total scam. Total scam.
I like how one of the last images she landed on the girl in the car.
Oh yeah.
With her with the light. It circles all the way back to the beginning with the obscured face.
Oh,
It
yeah.
could be any girl, but put it in a totally different context.
It's good.
Oh, that's a nice connection. Yeah, I think it's ambiguous, right? Like the gender, but yeah, and I like that ambiguity for sure. I mean, there's all kinds of ambiguity. Like, what is? I guess this is the arm, right? But yeah, I mean, I love the ambiguity of it. I mean, it's like based off a photo, so it's like, okay, this is scientific, a scientific depiction of a thing that happened.
Well, it's also interesting.
It's very ambiguous at the same time.
It's a car that still has the quarter window.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's the crank right there?
Yeah.
Go crank.
Right.
The crank to just
And they took it out and you got the vent, and
That's right.
we always called it the vent, but it was a quarter window, they called it in the industry.
The van. Yeah, that's the same artist as the Wiki Wachi performer painting as well.
Oh, I'm already there.
Yeah, I had a blast through these last ones, but definitely recommend going to rogerclaypalmer.com. He's got to be 80 something at this point, but he's been making work like this for decades, and it's very funny but very dark, and a lot of it you just like can't show. It's like too upsetting. but it's like just because of how real it is, basically. But yeah, thanks, gang. I'll be around if you have any questions.
Thanks, sir.